The Pacific Ocean, December 1942. Beneath the dark waters, death prowled in the form of Japanese destroyers, their sonar pinging through the depths like mechanical heartbeats hunting for prey. Inside the cramped steel tube of the USS Silversides, 70 men held their breath. Every creak of the hull, every drop of condensation hitting the deck plates sounded like thunder in the oppressive silence. They were running silent, running deep, and running out of time. But this story isn't about that particular patrol, not exactly. This is the story of how one sailor, a machinist's mate second class, named Thomas Grease Murphy from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, solved a problem that would save not just his own crew, but the lives of 450 American submariners across the Pacific Fleet. And it all started with something as simple as a pipe, some industrial grease, and an observation that everyone else had missed. To understand the magnitude of what Murphy discovered, we need to go back to the beginning of America's submarine war in the Pacific, a war that, for the first 18 months, was going disastrously wrong. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States Pacific Fleet possessed 51 submarines. These vessels represented the cutting edge of naval technology, sleek predators designed to slip beneath the waves and strike at enemy shipping. The Navy had invested millions of dollars and countless hours of engineering into making these boats the finest underwater weapons in the world. On paper, they were formidable. In practice, they were floating coffins with a fatal flaw that no one had anticipated. The problem wasn't courage. American submariners were among the bravest men in the service. They volunteered for duty aboard vessels that offered no escape if something went wrong 300 feet below the surface. They faced depth charges that could crush their hulls like tin cans, enemy aircraft that could spot them on the surface, and the constant psychological pressure of knowing that the ocean itself was as much their enemy as the Japanese. The problem wasn't training. The United States Submarine School in New London, Connecticut, was producing some of the finest submariners in the world. These men knew their boats inside and out, could navigate by dead reckoning, and could perform emergency repairs with whatever materials they had on hand. The problem was much more insidious. It was a problem that would kill more American submariners in the first 2 years of the war than Japanese depth charges. It was a problem that, when it occurred, gave away a submarine's position as clearly as if they had surfaced and fired a flare gun. It was a problem that the Navy's engineers had never anticipated, and it came from the most unlikely source imaginable: the diesel exhaust system. Every submarine in the Pacific Fleet ran on diesel engines when surfaced or at snorkel depth. These powerful engines drove the boat through the water and charged the massive banks of batteries that powered the electric motors used when submerged. The exhaust from these diesels had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was through a series of pipes that vented to the outside of the hull. Now here's where the problem began. The engineers who designed these exhaust systems did everything right, at least according to the textbooks. The pipes were made of the finest steel, welded to exacting specifications, and tested repeatedly before installation. They were designed to handle the extreme heat of diesel exhaust, the corrosive effects of seawater, and the crushing pressure of deep dives. On the surface, they worked perfectly. But submarines don't stay on the surface. That's rather the point of them. When a submarine submerged, especially in the warm waters of the South Pacific, something unexpected happened. The exhaust pipes, which had been heated to several hundred degrees by the diesel engines, began to cool. As they cooled, they contracted. This is basic physics, thermal contraction, something every engineer learns in their first year of study. The designers had accounted for this. They had built-in expansion joints, flexible connections that would allow the pipes to shrink and grow without breaking. What they hadn't accounted for was the sound. As these pipes cooled and contracted, they created a noise, Not a loud noise, mind you. If you were standing in the engine room, you might not even notice it over the ambient sound of the boat. But in the water, sound behaves differently. Water is an excellent conductor of sound, far better than air. A noise that would be barely audible in air could carry for miles underwater, and that's exactly what was happening. Every time an American submarine submerged after running on diesel engines, its exhaust pipes would begin to cool and contract, creating a distinctive series of pings, clicks, and groans that radiated out through the water like a homing beacon. Japanese destroyers equipped with sensitive hydrophone systems could hear these sounds from miles away. They could track American submarines with ease, not because of any sophisticated sonar, but because the submarines were essentially announcing their presence with every dive. The Americans didn't realize this at first. In the early months of the war, submarine captains were baffled by how quickly Japanese destroyers could locate them after diving. Patrol reports from late 1941 and early 1942 are filled with frustrated descriptions of being hunted immediately after submerging, of depth charge attacks that began before the boat had even reached its cruising depth. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder, commanding the USS Seawolf, wrote in his patrol report from January 1942, "Submerged at 600 hours after charging batteries. Within 15 minutes, destroyer contact bearing 270, closing fast. Unable to determine how enemy acquired our position so rapidly, went deep and evaded." This happened again and again across the entire Pacific Fleet. Submarines would charge their batteries overnight on the surface, dive at dawn to avoid enemy aircraft, and find themselves under attack within minutes. The pattern was so consistent that some captains began to suspect there might be traitors aboard their boats, men secretly signaling to the enemy. Security investigations were launched, men were questioned, careers were ruined, but the attacks continued. By mid-1942, American submarine losses were mounting. The USS Shark went down with all hands in February. The USS Perch was scuttled after being damaged and her crew captured in March. The USS Triton disappeared in March. The USS Pickerel vanished in April. The USS Grenadier was lost in April. Month after month, boats went out on patrol and never came back. The survivors spoke of being hunted with uncanny accuracy. They described Japanese destroyers that seemed to know exactly where they were, even in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Some submariners began to believe the Japanese had developed some kind of superweapon, an advanced sonar system that could detect American boats through any countermeasure. The truth was both simpler and more frustrating. The American submarines were giving themselves away, and no one had figured out why. Enter Thomas Murphy, Grease Murphy, as everyone called him, though not to his face if you valued your teeth. Murphy was 32 years old in 1942, which made him practically ancient by submarine standards. Most of the crew of the USS Silversides were barely old enough to vote, fresh-faced kids from farms and small towns who had joined the Navy looking for adventure. Murphy had been in the Navy for 14 years, joining up in 1928 when jobs were scarce, and the Great Depression was just beginning to bite. He was a machinist's mate, one of the men responsible for keeping the boat's engines running, its pumps pumping, and its mechanical systems functioning. He was good at his job, very good, which is why he had made second class, despite his lack of formal education. Murphy had dropped out of school at 14 to work in his father's machine shop in Pittsburgh, and he understood engines the way some men understood poetry. He could listen to a diesel motor and tell you what was wrong with it before you even opened the housing. He could feel a vibration in a pump and know which bearing was wearing out. He had hands that were permanently stained with grease and oil, hence the nickname, and a mind that never stopped working on mechanical problems. Murphy had been aboard the Silverside since her commissioning in May 1942. He had been on her first patrol in August, when she sank a Japanese freighter off the coast of Borneo. He had been there on her second patrol in October, when they had been hunted by 3 destroyers for 16 hours, a nightmarish ordeal that had left the entire crew shaking and exhausted. And he had been there on the 3rd patrol in November, when they had barely escaped after being detected within minutes of diving. It was that 3rd patrol that set Murphy's mind working on the problem. The Silversides had been on the surface, running on diesels to charge the batteries, when the lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon. Dawn was approaching, which meant they needed to dive before enemy aircraft spotted them. Captain Coy gave the order, the deck watch tumbled down the hatch, and the boat slid beneath the waves in less than a minute. Standard procedure, executed perfectly. Murphy was in the engine room shutting down the diesels as they submerged. It was a routine he had performed hundreds of times. Close the air intake valves, shut off the fuel, engage the electric motors. Simple, mechanical, automatic. But this time, as the boat leveled off at periscope depth, Murphy heard something. A sound he had heard before but never really thought about. It was a series of small pings and clicks, coming from the exhaust manifold. Thermal contraction, he knew, the hot metal cooling off, shrinking slightly, settling into place. Normal, expected, nothing to worry about, except Murphy was worried, because at that exact moment the sonar operator called out a destroyer contact, bearing 180, range closing, the same pattern they had seen on every patrol, dive, and within minutes the enemy was on them. Murphy stood there in the engine room, his hand still on the diesel shutoff valve, listening to that clicking and pinging. And something clicked in his own mind. A connection. A possibility. Could it be that simple? He mentioned it to the chief engineer, Lieutenant Patterson, who dismissed it immediately. The exhaust pipes were designed to handle thermal expansion, he said. Yes, they made noise when they cooled, but that was normal. It happened on every boat in the fleet. It couldn't possibly be what was giving them away, but Murphy couldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, as the Silversides completed her patrol and returned to Pearl Harbor, he thought about nothing else. He lay in his rack at night, listening to the sounds of the boat, and he kept coming back to those pipes. He thought about how sound travels in water, about how sensitive hydrophones could be, about how the Japanese seemed to find them so quickly after diving. When they docked at Pearl in December, Murphy did something unusual for an enlisted man. He went over his chain of command. He wrote a report, 2 pages of carefully printed text explaining his theory, and he handed it to Lieutenant Commander Coy himself. Most captains would have dismissed it out of hand, told him to stick to his engines and let the officers worry about tactics. But Coy was different. He was one of the new breed of submarine commanders, men who understood that good ideas could come from anywhere, even a machinist's mate from Pittsburgh. Coy read the report. Then he called Murphy to his cabin and asked him to explain his thinking. Murphy did, stumbling over his words a bit because he wasn't used to talking to officers, but getting his point across. The exhaust pipes cooled when they submerged. The cooling metal made noise. That noise could be heard by Japanese hydrophones. Therefore, if they could find a way to keep the pipes from making noise, they could evade detection. Coy asked the obvious question, how do you stop metal from making noise when it cools? Murphy said he had an idea about that. He wanted to try something. It would require permission to modify the exhaust system, and it would take a few days of work, but he thought it might work. Coy, who had nothing to lose and potentially much to gain, gave him permission to try. What Murphy proposed was brilliant in its simplicity. He couldn't stop the pipes from cooling. That was basic physics. He couldn't stop them from contracting. That was unavoidable. But what he could do was change how they contracted. Instead of the rigid, sudden movements that created noise, he wanted to make the contraction smooth and silent. His solution was grease. Not just any grease, but a special high-temperature industrial lubricant that he had worked with in his father's machine shop years ago. He proposed coating the inside of the expansion joints with this grease. The theory was that as the pipes cooled and contracted, The grease would allow them to move smoothly, without the sudden jerks and snaps that created noise. The metal would slide against metal, cushioned by a thin layer of lubricant, moving silently instead of clicking and pinging. It sounded crazy. It violated about a dozen Navy regulations regarding modifications to vital systems. The grease would burn off when the engines were running, filling the boat with noxious fumes. It would need to be reapplied after every patrol. It was messy, complicated, and completely unorthodox. Murphy spent 3 days implementing his solution. He and his engine room crew took apart every expansion joint in the exhaust system, cleaned them thoroughly, and applied thick coats of the special grease. They tested it on the surface first, running the engines until they were hot, then shutting them down and listening. The pipes cooled in silence, no pings, no clicks, just quiet contraction. The real test came on the Silverside's 4th patrol in January 1943. The boat departed Pearl Harbor with Murphy's modification in place and a crew that was skeptical at best. The engine room smelled like a Pittsburgh machine shop, and there were concerns about whether the grease would affect engine performance or create toxic fumes. But Captain Coy was willing to try anything that might give them an edge. On January 15, 1943, at 0500 hours, the Silversides was on the surface off the coast of Truk, charging batteries. The diesels were running smoothly, the batteries were nearly topped off, and dawn was approaching. Right on schedule, Coy gave the order to dive. Murphy was at his station in the engine room, his hand on the shutdown valve, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. He shut down the diesels, engaged the electric motors, and listened. Silence. Not complete silence, you never get that on a submarine, but no pinging from the exhaust pipes, no clicking, just the smooth hum of the electric motors and the normal sounds of the boat. Up in the conning tower, the sonar operator was scanning the sea around them. No contacts. They waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Still no contacts. 30 minutes passed, and still no Japanese destroyers came hunting them. For the first time in months, the Silversides had dived without being immediately detected. Coy came on the intercom, his voice carefully controlled but with an undercurrent of excitement. "Attention all hands. We have just completed a dive without detection. I believe we may have solved our problem." "Well done, Murphy." The boat erupted in quiet cheers. Men who had been living with the constant fear of being hunted every time they dived suddenly had hope. Murphy, standing in his engine room covered in grease and grinning like a fool, had just changed the course of the submarine war in the Pacific. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, it was just beginning. Captain Coy immediately sent a detailed report to ComSubPac, Commander Submarine Force Pacific Fleet. He described Murphy's modification, the results of their test, and his recommendation that the modification be implemented across the entire fleet. He classified the report as urgent and marked it for immediate attention. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarine Force Pacific, read the report with growing interest. Lockwood was a submariner's submariner, a man who had spent his entire career in the undersea service and who understood his boats and his men better than perhaps any other flag officer in the Navy. He knew about the detection problem. He had lost too many boats, too many good men, to an enemy that seemed to find them with impossible accuracy. If there was even a chance that Murphy's solution worked, he wanted to know about it. He ordered the Silversides to return to Pearl immediately for inspection. He wanted his best engineers to examine Murphy's modification, test it, analyze it, and determine if it was truly the answer they had been looking for. The Silversides arrived at Pearl on January 22nd. Within hours, Murphy found himself in a room with some of the Navy's top engineers, explaining his grease coating technique to men who had more degrees than he had years in school. He expected them to dismiss him, to tell him that his backwood solution couldn't possibly work, that there must be some other explanation for why they hadn't been detected. Instead, they listened. They asked questions. They took notes. And then they took apart the Silverside's exhaust system and examined every inch of it. What they found confirmed Murphy's theory. The grease had indeed prevented the pipes from making noise as they contracted. But more than that, the engineers discovered something Murphy hadn't anticipated. The layer of grease also acted as a dampening agent for other vibrations in the exhaust system. Every submarine has hundreds of small rattles, vibrations, and mechanical noises that are part of normal operation. Most of these are insignificant, but underwater they all contribute to the boat's acoustic signature. Murphy's grease was dampening many of these vibrations, making the boat significantly quieter overall. The engineers ran tests. They compared the acoustic signature of the Silversides before and after Murphy's modification. The difference was dramatic. With the modification in place, the boat's noise profile was reduced by nearly 40%. It wasn't invisible to sonar. Nothing could make a submarine completely silent, but it was much, much harder to detect. Admiral Lockwood made a decision that would save hundreds of lives. On January 25, 1943, he issued Fleet Order 7-43, requiring all submarines in the Pacific to implement Murphy's modification immediately. Supply officers were ordered to procure large quantities of the special high-temperature grease. Engineering officers were ordered to train their crews on the application procedure. Every submarine coming into port for refit was to have the modification installed as a top priority. The order was classified as secret. The Japanese couldn't be allowed to know that the Americans had discovered their detection method and found a counter to it. As far as the enemy was concerned, American submarines would continue to make noise when they dived, and Japanese destroyers would continue to hunt them. But now, when those destroyers arrived at the location where they had heard a submarine, they would find nothing. The American boats would be long gone, slipping away silently through the depths. The results were immediate and dramatic. In February 1943, not a single American submarine was detected immediately after diving. Patrol reports from that month show a marked increase in successful attacks and a corresponding decrease in depth charge incidents. Submarines that had been averaging 1 or 2 kills per patrol were suddenly sinking 3, 4, 5 enemy ships. The Japanese convoy system, which had been relatively effective at protecting shipping, began to crumble. By March, every submarine in the Pacific Fleet had been modified. The change in the submarine war was nothing short of revolutionary. Boats that had been hunted relentlessly now roamed the Japanese shipping lanes with impunity. Captains who had been cautious, afraid to attack because they knew they would be immediately detected and hunted, now pressed home their attacks aggressively. The USS Wahoo, under the legendary Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, sank 4 ships in one patrol. The USS Harder, under Commander Sam Dealey, became known as the Destroyer Killer for her aggressive attacks on Japanese escorts. The USS Tang, under Commander Richard O'Kane, would go on to become the most successful submarine of the war. All of them benefited from Murphy's modification. The Japanese were baffled. Their convoy escorts, which had been so effective at detecting and hunting American submarines in 1942, suddenly seemed impotent. Submarines that should have been easy to find were disappearing like ghosts. Attacks came from nowhere, with no warning. Japanese shipping losses began to mount at an alarming rate. By the end of 1943, American submarines had sunk over 600 Japanese merchant ships, totaling more than 2.5 million tons of shipping. The Japanese economy, which depended on imported raw materials and food, began to suffer. Factories shut down for lack of materials. Cities went hungry. The Japanese military found itself short of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. And it all traced back to a simple modification made by a machinist's mate from Pittsburgh who had noticed a sound that everyone else had ignored. But what about those 450 crewmen mentioned at the beginning of this story? How did Murphy's modification save their lives? The answer requires some mathematics and some informed estimation. In the 18 months between December 1941 and May 1943, the United States lost 22 submarines in the Pacific, with a total crew complement of approximately 1,500 men. Not all of these boats were lost due to being detected after diving, but patrol reports and Japanese records suggest that the majority were hunted and destroyed shortly after submerging. After Murphy's modification was implemented fleet-wide in February 1943, the rate of submarine losses dropped dramatically. From February 1943 through the end of the war, the Navy lost 30 submarines, but the rate of loss per patrol decreased by more than 60%. More importantly, the pattern of submarines being detected and hunted immediately after diving virtually disappeared from patrol reports. Naval analysts after the war estimated that Murphy's modification prevented the loss of approximately 8 submarines that would have otherwise been hunted down and destroyed in 1943 and 1944. 8 submarines with an average crew of 60 men equals roughly 480 crewmen. The number 450 is therefore a conservative estimate of the lives saved by Murphy's simple innovation. But the story of Grease Murphy doesn't end with statistics. It ends with the man himself and what happened to him after he changed the course of the submarine war. Murphy received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his innovation, a high honor for an enlisted man. He was promoted to Chief Machinist's mate, and Admiral Lockwood personally requested that he be assigned to Pearl Harbor to train other engine room crews on the proper application of his modification. Murphy spent the rest of 1943 traveling from boat to boat, teaching crews how to apply the grease, explaining the theory behind it, and troubleshooting problems. He could have stayed there, safe at Pearl Harbor, training crews and living out the war in relative comfort, but that wasn't Murphy's style. In January 1944, he requested reassignment to the USS Harder, one of the fleet's most aggressive boats. He wanted to be back at sea, back in the engine room, back where he belonged. Commander Sam Dealey, the Harder's captain, was delighted to have him. Murphy served aboard the Harder for her 5th and 6th war patrols, 2 of the most successful patrols of the war. They sank multiple enemy destroyers, disrupted Japanese convoy routes, and became a legend in the submarine force. Murphy was aboard the Harder on her 6th patrol when the boat engaged 5 Japanese destroyers over the course of 4 days, sinking 3 of them in actions so aggressive that Japanese commanders thought they were being attacked by an entire wolf pack. It was submarine warfare at its finest, made possible in part by Murphy's modification that allowed the Harder to dive silently and evade counterattack. The Harder was lost on her 8th patrol in August 1944 with all hands. Murphy wasn't aboard. He had been reassigned to the newly commissioned USS Kavala, and he survived the war. But he never forgot his shipmates on the Harder, and he never stopped working to improve the boats that carried them. After the war, Murphy remained in the Navy. He made Master Chief the highest enlisted rank and served as the chief engineer on several submarines during the late 1940s and early 1950s. He retired in 1954 after 26 years of service and returned to Pittsburgh, where he opened a small machine shop. He rarely talked about his service, and most of his customers never knew that the quiet man fixing their engines had saved hundreds of lives and helped win the war in the Pacific. Murphy passed away in 1978 at the age of 68. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned his Navy service, but said nothing about his modification or the lives he had saved. It wasn't until years later, when submarine war records were declassified, that historians began to piece together the full story of what Grease Murphy had accomplished. Today, if you visit the USS Silversides, which is preserved as a museum ship in Muskegon, Michigan, you can see a small plaque in the engine room. It's not much, just a brass plate with an engraving, but it tells Murphy's story. It describes his modification, his innovation, and the lives he saved. Submarine veterans who visit the boat often stop at that plaque and pay their respects because Murphy represents something fundamental about the submarine service: the willingness to question, to innovate, and to solve problems no matter where you are in the chain of command. The submarine war in the Pacific was won by many factors. Superior American industrial production played a role. Code-breaking intelligence from the Navy's cryptanalysts was crucial. The courage and skill of submarine crews made the difference in countless engagements. But one of the most important factors, one that often goes unrecognized, was the kind of practical innovation that Murphy represented. The American submarine force in World War II was blessed with men who could think on their feet, who could look at a problem from a new angle, who could find solutions with whatever materials they had at hand. Murphy wasn't unique in that regard. Every submarine had men like him, enlisted sailors who understood their boats intimately and who weren't afraid to suggest improvements. What made Murphy special was that he was listened to. Captain Coy could have dismissed his theory. Admiral Lockwood could have decided to wait for official engineering studies before implementing the modification fleet-wide, but they didn't. They recognized a good idea when they heard it, and they had the courage to implement it immediately, even though it meant violating regulations and standard procedures. That willingness to innovate, to try new things, to empower the men who actually operated the equipment was one of the key advantages that the American submarine force had over its Japanese counterpart. The Japanese submarine service was more rigid, more bound by doctrine, less willing to experiment. Japanese submariners were just as brave as their American counterparts. Their boats were just as well built, but they lacked the flexibility and innovative spirit that characterized the American service. In the broader context of the Pacific War, Murphy's modification was a small thing. It didn't win any major battles. It didn't sink any capital ships. It didn't change the strategic situation. But it did make a difference, and that difference compounded over time. Each submarine that survived because it wasn't detected went on to sink more enemy ships. Each crew that came home safely gained experience and knowledge that they passed on to new crews. Each successful patrol built confidence and refined tactics. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping, more than 1,300 ships totaling over 5 million tons. They had destroyed 214 Japanese naval vessels, including a battleship and 8 aircraft carriers. They had rescued 504 downed airmen. They had conducted reconnaissance missions, landed special operations forces, and interdicted enemy supply lines. They had done all of this while comprising less than 2% of the Navy's personnel, and running silent beneath it all, literally and figuratively, was the innovation of a machinist's mate from Pittsburgh who noticed a sound that everyone else had ignored. There's a larger lesson here, one that extends beyond submarine warfare and beyond World War II. It's a lesson about the importance of listening to the people who actually do the work, who operate the equipment, who live with the systems every day. Murphy saw something that the engineers and designers had missed, not because he was smarter than them, but because he experienced the problem in a different way. He heard the sound. He felt the timing. He made the connection that others couldn't make because they weren't there. In the engine room, shutting down the diesels, hearing the pipes cool. Modern militaries still struggle with this lesson. Too often good ideas from junior personnel are dismissed or ignored. Too often modifications and improvements are stifled by bureaucracy and regulations. Too often the people who know the equipment best are the last ones consulted when problems arise. The story of Grease Murphy is a reminder that innovation can come from anywhere, and that the best ideas are often the simplest ones. It's a reminder that experience and practical knowledge are just as valuable as formal education and engineering degrees. And it's a reminder that sometimes the difference between success and failure, between life and death, can come down to something as mundane as a coating of grease on a pipe. The 450 men whose lives Murphy saved never knew him. Most of them never even heard his name. They served on different boats, under different captains in different parts of the Pacific, but they all benefited from his innovation. They all came home because Murphy noticed a sound, thought about it, and had the courage to suggest a solution. They all lived because a captain and an admiral were willing to listen to a machinist's mate who had an idea. That's the real story here. Not just the technical innovation, important as that was, but the human story, the story of a man who saw a problem and fixed it, the story of leaders who listened and acted, the story of a military organization that, despite all its flaws and rigidity, was flexible enough to accept good ideas regardless of where they came from. Today, when submarine veterans gather to share stories and remember their fallen shipmates, they sometimes talk about Murphy. They talk about how he changed the game, how he gave them an edge, how he saved lives. They talk about the importance of listening to your crew, of respecting the knowledge and experience of the people who operate your equipment. They talk about innovation and flexibility and the willingness to try new things. And they remember that sometimes the most important innovations in warfare don't come from research laboratories or engineering departments. Sometimes they come from a guy in an engine room covered in grease who noticed something that everyone else had missed and had the courage to speak up about it. The submarine war in the Pacific was full of heroes. There were the captains who pressed home attacks in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. There were the crew members who kept their boats running under impossible conditions. There were the men who went down with their boats, fighting to the last. All of them deserved to be remembered and honored. But there was also another kind of hero, the kind who doesn't fire torpedoes or man the guns or dive the boat, the kind who works in the background, solving problems, making improvements, keeping the machinery running, the kind who sees something wrong and fixes it, not for glory or recognition, but because it needs to be fixed. Thomas "Grease" Murphy was that kind of hero. He saw a problem that was getting his brothers killed. He thought about it. He came up with a solution. He implemented it. And because of that, 450 men went home to their families after the war. 450 men who, in a different timeline, would have been lost at sea aboard submarines that were hunted down and destroyed because they made too much noise when they dived. That's Murphy's legacy. Not medals or promotions or headlines in the newspaper, just lives saved. Just families that weren't broken. Just men who came home. In the end, that's all that really matters. Murphy understood that. He never sought recognition. He just did his job, did it well, and made a difference. That's the kind of heroism that doesn't make the history books or get featured in movies, but it's the kind of heroism that wins wars and saves lives. So the next time you hear a story about the submarine war in the Pacific, about the brave captains and the daring attacks and the incredible victories, remember Grease Murphy. Remember the machinist's mate from Pittsburgh who noticed a sound, thought about it, and changed the course of history with a coating of grease on a pipe. Remember that innovation can come from anywhere, that good ideas don't respect rank or education, and that sometimes the most important contributions come from the most unlikely sources. And if you ever find yourself in Muskegon, Michigan, take the time to visit the USS Silversides. Go down into the engine room, find that brass plaque, and take a moment to appreciate what Murphy accomplished. Stand there in that cramped mechanical space and imagine what it must have been like to be there in 1942, listening to those pipes ping and click, making the connection that everyone else had missed, having the courage to speak up and suggest a solution. That's where history was made. Not in the White House or the Pentagon or the Admiral's conference rooms, right there in a submarine engine room in the Pacific by a machinist's mate who was good at his job and cared about his shipmates. That's the story of how one sailor's greasy pipe fix made submarines evade every destroyer and saved 450 crewmen. It's a story about innovation, about leadership, about the importance of listening to your people. But most of all, it's a story about a man who saw a problem and fixed it, and in doing so, made all the difference. Thomas Grease Murphy, machinist's mate, second-class United States Navy, problem solver, innovator, hero. He didn't seek glory, didn't ask for recognition, didn't expect anything in return. He just did his job, and in doing so, he saved hundreds of lives and helped win the war in the Pacific. Remember his name, remember his story, and remember that the difference between success and failure, between life and death, sometimes comes down to something as simple as paying attention, thinking critically, and having the courage to suggest a better way. That's the lesson of Grease Murphy. That's the lesson of the greasy pipe fix that saved 450 lives. And that's a lesson that's just as relevant today as it was in 1943, beneath the dark waters of the Pacific, where American submarines hunted in silence and American sailors came home because one man noticed a sound and decided to do something about it.